July 7, 1968. At exactly 6:47 in the morning, the phone rang in Frank Lucas's apartment. 2 words came through the line. He's gone. No build-up, no explanation. Just silence on the other end. Frank already knew what it meant. Bumpy Johnson, the most powerful black gangster Harlem had ever known, was dead. A heart attack, 62 years old, no warning, no goodbye. Just gone. Frank dropped the phone and sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. For 15 years, Bumpy had been more than a boss. He was a mentor, a protector, a father. Figure in a world that offered black men only 2 endings, prison or the grave. Bumpy had taught Frank how to move, how to think, how to survive quietly in a violent system that didn't forgive mistakes. Now, the man who ran Harlem, who negotiated with the Italian Mafia as an equal, who kept the streets balanced, who controlled a criminal empire worth roughly $50 million a year, was dead. Frank's wife Eva touched his shoulder. "Baby? What's wrong?" Frank barely heard her. "Bumpy's dead." Eva gasped. "Oh God, Frank. I'm so sorry." But Frank's grief lasted only a moment, because his mind had already shifted gears. While the rest of Harlem was still waking up, Frank understood something no one else had fully processed yet. When a king dies, there is always a war for the throne. And Bumpy Johnson's throne was worth killing for. Harlem's heroin trade. The numbers racket. Protection money. Political favors. Every mob faction in New York had a piece of that pie, but Bumpy controlled the kitchen. Without him, the balance was gone. Italians, Irish, Chinese crews, black gangs, everyone would be watching the same thing. Who stepped forward, and nobody was thinking about Frank Lucas. To them, Frank was invisible. Bumpy's driver. The errand boy. The guy who carried bags, picked up dry cleaning, opened doors. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He didn't have a crew following him down the street. That was exactly why no one saw him coming. Frank stood up and started getting dressed. Eva watched him. "Where are you going?" "To the bank?" She frowned. "The bank? It's not even 7 in the morning. I need to withdraw some money." "How much?" Frank looked at her and didn't hesitate. "All of it," 3 hours later. Frank. Lucas walked out of Chase Manhattan Bank carrying a briefcase with $100,000 in cash. In 1968, that wasn't just money, that was a statement. Nearly $800,000 in today's value. Every dollar he'd saved in 15 years. No jewelry, no cars. No wasted excess. Everything he had. Eva was waiting in the car, panic written all over her face. "Frank, what are you doing? Someone could rob you, kill you." Frank looked at her calmly. "Baby, I'm about to walk into a room with every gangster in New York. If I'm walking in there, I'm walking in like a king. Not like Bumpy's driver." The funeral was held at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, the biggest church in the neighborhood. Room for 2,000 people, and every seat was filled. Community leaders. Politicians, hustlers, street soldiers. People who loved Bumpy. People who feared him. People who owed him favors they'd never repay. And sitting in the front rows, dressed in tailored suits, were the predators. Italian mob bosses. Black gang leaders. Men who had spent their entire lives waiting for a moment like this. For Harlem to be unguarded. Frank arrived, late on purpose. Black suit, black tie, black fedora, briefcase in hand. Every head turned at first. There was confusion, then recognition. Oh, that's just Bumpy's driver. Interest faded. Conversations resumed. Nobody moved to stop him. Frank didn't sit down. He walked straight to the front of the church, toward Bumpy Johnson's open casket. He set the briefcase on the floor, opened it. Inside were stacks of crisp $100 bills. Frank reached in and pulled out the first stacked $10,000 and placed it gently on Bumpy's chest. The church went quiet. Then he pulled out another stack, another 10,000. Then another. And another, 10 stacks, $100,000 in cash, placed directly inside the casket. On top of Bumpy Johnson's body, no one breathed. In front of 2,000 people, politicians, mobsters, killers. Frank Lucas had just put his entire life savings into a dead man's coffin. Then he did something even more dangerous. Frank turned around and faced the room. "My name is Frank Lucas," he said. "For 15 years, I worked for Bumpy Johnson. And Bumpy taught me one thing, above everything else." He paused. He said, "Frank, in this life, you're either somebody or you're nobody. And the only way people know you're somebody is if you show them." Frank gestured toward the casket. Bumpy Johnson was somebody. The greatest somebody Harlem has ever seen. And when a king dies, you don't let him go into the ground, Brot. The silence was unbearable. You send him off like royalty. Frank straightened his shoulders. "So I'm sending my king off with $100,000. Because that's what respect looks like." Then he went farther than anyone expected. "I know what all of you are thinking," Frank said. "You're wondering who's going to run Harlem now. You think it's going to be one of you?" He pointed toward the front row. "You think you're going to come up here and take what Bumpy built?" Then the words that changed everything. "You're all wrong. Because Bumpy didn't leave his empire to you. He left it to me." The church erupted. Men stood up. Shouts echoed. Threats were whispered. Frank didn't flinch. "I was a driver," he said. "Now I'm king." He locked eyes with the mobsters. "Because I just did something none of you could do? I showed respect when it mattered. And starting today, Harlem belongs to Harlem." Frank turned back to the casket. "Rest in peace, boss. I'm going to make you proud." And then he walked out of the Church of Rei, following him, leaving behind $100,000. A stunned underworld, and a power shift one could undo. That funeral wasn't just goodbye, it was a declaration of war. Frank Lucas walked out of Abyssinian Baptist Church with his heart pounding, not from fear, but from adrenaline. He had just done the most dangerous thing a man in his position could do. He didn't whisper. He didn't wait. He didn't ask permission. He claimed power in front of witnesses who made their living killing men for less. As soon as Frank slid into the passenger seat, Eva turned toward him, her hands shaking. "Frank, what did you just do?" Frank exhaled slowly. His palms were damp. His chest felt tight. "I just became king of Harlem." Eva stared at him, like he'd lost his mind. "You've just signed your death warrant? The Italians are going to kill you. Nicky Barnes is going to kill you. Everybody in that church wants you dead right now." Frank lit a cigarette, his hand finally trembling. "Maybe," he said. "But not today." Eva shook her head. "Why not?" "Because every gangster in that room is asking the same question right now," Frank said. "If Frank Lucas can throw away $100,000 like it's nothing, how much money does he really have? How connected is he? And how dangerous is he?" That was the point. Frank didn't just put money in a casket. He planted doubt. He created uncertainty. And uncertainty was protection. Bumpy had taught him that. Real power wasn't about violence, it was about perception. Make a move so bold that people can't tell if you're a genius or a lunatic. While they're debating it, you consolidate. Aoife looked at him. And if they decide you're stupid? Frank took a drag and stared out the window. Then I die. As somebody. Not as Bumpy's driver. They drove home in silence. When they opened the apartment door, the phone was already ringing. Frank stared at it for a moment before answering. Yeah, he said. Frank Lucas. A voice on the other end, cold Italian, controlled. We need to talk. Who's this? Carmine Tremonti. Frank felt the blood drain from his face. Tremonti was one of the most powerful men in New York. An acting boss of the Lucchese crime family. If Carmine wanted to talk, there were only two reasons: a deal or a death sentence. Talk, Tremonti said. Not on the phone. Meet me tonight, 8 o'clock, Ralph's restaurant. Come alone. The line went dead. Eva looked at Frank. Terrified? Who is that? The Mafia. She grabbed his arm. You can't go. They'll kill you. Frank nodded slowly. If I don't go, they'll kill me anyway. That night, Frank Lucas walked into Ralph's restaurant in East Harlem, a tiny place with 10 tables and a reputation that made men disappear. The entire restaurant had been cleared. One table remained. Carmine Tremonti sat there with 4 bodyguards. Frank walked over and sat down without asking permission. Tremonti steadied him for a long moment. You got balls, he said. I'll give you that. I learned from the best, Frank replied. Tremonti poured wine into 2 glasses. Bumpy had an arrangement with us. He ran Harlem. We took 20%. Everybody was happy. Frank didn't touch his glass. Now Bumpy's gone, Tremonti continued. And you're sitting in a church telling me that deal is over? Frank leaned forward. It's only a problem if you make it one. Tremonti's eyes narrowed. You threatening me? I'm stating facts, Frank said calmly. Harlem is mine now. I'm not paying 20%. Not paying anything. But I'm not trying to take your territory either. And what makes you think you can hold Harlem without our permission? Frank didn't raise his voice. He didn't blink. Because I have something you don't. What's that? I have the people, Frank said. Harlem trusted Bumpy. They saw who stood next to him for 15 years. They saw who put $100,000 in his casket out of respect. You think you can walk in and take over? Harlem will burn before they let that happen. Tremonti considered this. And that money? He said. Where'd you get it? Saved it, Frank replied. While everyone else spent theirs trying to look important. So you're broke now. Frank smiled. No, I'm invested. That was when Tremonti smiled back. You're smarter than I thought, he said. Here's what I'm going to do. I'll give you 6 months. Frank waited. 6 months to prove you can run Harlem without us. Keep the peace. Make money. Control your people. If you can do that, we respect your independence. And I fail. Then we take everything. Frank extended his hand. Deal. They shook as Frank walked out into the night. He knew the truth. The Italians weren't betting on him, they were betting against him. And Frank Lucas had exactly 6 months to prove that the funeral wasn't just theatre, was the beginning of something real. Claiming a throne was one thing. Holding it was something else entirely. When Frank Lucas walked out of Ralph's restaurant with a 6-month clock hanging over his head, Harlem didn't suddenly fall in line. If anything, the streets laughed. To most people in the underworld, Frank was still the same man. He'd always been Bumpy Johnson's driver. The quiet one. The man who carried bags and opened doors. A placeholder, temporary. They thought the funeral was theatre. They were wrong. 3 days after Bumpy was buried, the first test came. Nicky Barnes, Harlem's loudest, flashiest, and most ambitious gangster, walked into one of Frank's heroin spots on 145th Street with his crew. No warning, no negotiation. Told Frank's dealers, "You work for me now?" He told them Frank was finished. Told them the real power had arrived. When the word reached Frank, he didn't yell. He didn't call a meeting. He didn't send shooters. He went alone. That night, Frank walked to Nicky Barnes's apartment, knocked on the door like a man stopping by to borrow sugar. Nicky opened it, surprised. "Frank?" "What the hell?" Frank pulled out a gun and pressed it directly to Nicky's forehead. "You got 2 choices," Frank said calmly. "Choice 1, you come work for me. I'll make you rich. You'll be respected. You'll be my right hand." Nicky laughed nervously. "You bluffing?" Frank pulled the hammer back. The click echoed in the room. "Choice 2, Frank said. "I pull this trigger right now. And every dealer in Harlem learns what happens when you disrespect Frank." "Lucas." Nicky stopped smiling. He stared into Frank's eyes, trying to read him, trying to decide if this quiet man was capable of murder. Frank didn't blink. Nicky raised his hands. All right, I'll work with you." Frank lowered the gun. "Smart," he said, "because here's the truth. You want to be famous? You want everyone to know your name. That's how you get arrested. That's how you get killed." Frank leaned closer. "I want to be rich." He laid out the deal. Nicky Barnes would be the face's celebrity gangster, the man in the papers, the one everyone talked about. Frank would stay invisible. The supplier, the strategist, the shadow. "You get the glory," Frank said. "I get the money." Nicky nodded slowly. That partnership changed everything. On the streets, Nicky Barnes looked like the king of Harlem. But behind the scenes, every brick, every dollar, every decision flowed through Frank Lucas. And Frank had a bigger problem to solve. The heroin. For decades, Harlem dealers were trapped in a rigged system. The Italians bought heroin from the Corsican mob in France, then sold it to black dealers at massive markups. $50,000 a kilo for junk that was barely 10% pure. By the time it hit the streets, it had been cut so many times it was practically baby powder. Frank hated that setup. So he did something no American gangster had ever done. He cut out everyone. In 1969, Frank Lucas got on a plane and flew halfway around the world, first to Bangkok, then into the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia, where most of the world's opium was grown. Vietnam was still at war. Chaos everywhere. That chaos was opportunity. Frank met directly with Chinese and Thai suppliers. No Italians, no Corsicans, no middlemen. He negotiated face to face, and the deal he made was insane. 95% pure heroin. $4,000 per kilo. Not $50,000 for. Frank had just shattered the economics of the drug trade. But getting the product into America was the real challenge. Ports were watched. Airports were watched. Smugglers were watched. Frank needed something untouchable. That's when he noticed something no one else had. Dead American soldiers were being shipped home from Vietnam in sealed military coffins. Sacred cargo? Never inspected. Never opened. Frank bribed a few supply sergeants. The heroin was hidden inside false compartments in the coffins. No customs, no dogs, no inspections. The pipeline was invisible. When the first shipment landed in New York, Frank named it Blue Magic. It was blue-tinted, pure, powerful. Different? Word spread instantly. Blue magic was so strong that Frank could cut it 9 times and it would still outperform anything else on the street. And because his costs were so low, he could sell it cheaper than the Italians and still make 10 times the profit. Within months, everything changed. Dealers switched sides overnight. Corners flipped. Money flooded in. Frank paid his people salaries, not percentages. No partners. No one got power. No one knew the whole operation except him. That was deliberate. Nobody could betray what they didn't fully understand. By the end of 6 months, Frank Lucas controlled nearly 80% of Harlem's heroin trade. He had 250 people working for him. He was making roughly $1 million a day. The Italians couldn't figure it out. They watched the ports, nothing. They watched France, nothing. They followed Barnes, nothing. Finally, Carmine Tremonti called Frank back to Ralph's restaurant. "How are you doing this?" Tremonti asked. "We've been in this business 50 years, and we can't see your supply chain." Frank smiled. "That's because you're thinking like gangsters," he said. "I'm thinking like a businessman." Tremonti shook his head slowly. "You're smarter than Bumpy." Frank didn't smile at that. "Bumpy taught me well," he said. Tremonti asked the obvious question. "You going to expand? Brooklyn? Queens?" Frank shook his head. "No. I'm staying in Harlem. Making my money." Staying quiet. Because Frank understood the real danger. The bigger you get, the louder you become. And loud men don't last. For 5 years, Frank Lucas stayed invisible. He didn't chase fame. He didn't chase headlines. He watched others fall while he stacked money in silence. The funeral wasn't the end of the story. It was the opening move. And Harlem belonged to Frank Lucas now. For 5 years, Frank Lucas did everything right. From 1969 to 1974, he lived by one rule: stay invisible. He didn't give interviews. He didn't flash money in the streets. He didn't let his name become a rumor people whispered too loudly. While other gangsters chased fame, Frank stacked cash in silence. Buildings in Harlem. Homes in New Jersey. Businesses that looked clean from the outside. A criminal empire worth over $100 million hidden behind a man nobody noticed. Law enforcement knew someone was moving heroin at an unprecedented scale. They just couldn't figure out who. They watched the Italians. They watched the ports. They watched the French connection. Nothing. Frank's supply line was invisible, and that invisibility was his armor. Until one night, March 8, 1971. Madison Square Garden. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. The fight of the century. Every celebrity was there. Every politician. Every gangster who mattered. Ringside seats were impossible to get unless you were powerful. Frank Lucas sat ringside with his wife, Eva, smiling as the cameras flashed, and Frank made the decision that would destroy everything. He wore a chinchilla coat. Not just any coat. A floor-length chinchilla fur worth $50,000. The kind of coat that doesn't whisper, wealth, it screams it. The kind of coat that says, "I want to be seen." Frank had broken his own rule. Across the arena, a man named Richie Roberts, Uswachi, a detective in the Essex County Prosecutor's Office. Known for being honest in a world full of crooked cops. Known for following money instead of rumors. Roberts had been hearing whispers for years. About a quiet black man in Harlem. About heroin to pure. About money that didn't make sense. But whispers aren't evidence. That coat was Dot Roberts watched. Frank sitting ringside, draped in fur, surrounded by power. Completely unbothered. Nobody makes that kind of money legally. Nobody wears a $50,000 coat to a boxing match unless they're dirty. The next day, Richie Roberts started digging. He followed Frank, watched his movements, studied his associates, tracked vehicles, mapped patterns. Slowly, patiently, piece by piece, he built a case not just against Frank, but against the invisible system Frank had built. It took years, but invisibility only works until someone knows where to look. In 1975, the knock finally came. Federal agents and D officers raided Frank Lucas's home in Teaneck, New Jersey. Inside, they found what Frank had kept hidden for years: hundreds of thousands in cash, heroin, ledgers, proof. Frank Lucas was arrested as he sat in a jail cell facing life in prison. The truth hit him harder than the cuffs ever could. "Bumpy," Pangaea warned him. "The moment you want people to know you're rich," Bumpy had said, "you're finished." Frank had stayed silent for 5 years. Made more money than most mob bosses ever would. Outsmarted the mafia. Outsmarted the system. And then he wore a coat. One moment of vanity. One night of visibility. One mistake. And it cost him everything. Frank stared at the cell wall, replaying the fight, the lights, the fur draped over his shoulders. The empire hadn't fallen because it was weak. It fell because it was seen. For the first time since Bumpy's funeral, Frank Lucas understood the price of power, not just how to take it, but how easily it could be lost. And now, with life in prison looming, Frank had one final decision to make: disappear forever, or change the game one last time. Sitting in a jail cell, facing life in prison, Frank Lucas understood something most powerful men never do until it's too late. Power runs out. Money disappears. Allies vanish. Fear fades. But information that lasts. Frank made the call that would change everything. He asked to speak to the authorities and offered a deal no one could ignore. He would tell them everything. Not just names, but systems, routes, suppliers, dirty cops, mafia connections, the machinery behind the drug trade that had poisoned New York for decades. And Frank kept his word. He testified against Italian mobsters, against corrupt detectives, against entire police units that had been untouchable for years. His cooperation led to more than 100 arrests, including dozens of law enforcement officers. One of the most corrupt units in NYPD history was dismantled because Frank Lucas decided to talk. The sentence that should have buried him for life was reduced. 70 years became 15. Frank served 7. When he walked out of prison in 1981, the world he once ruled was gone. Harlem had changed. The drug game had become louder, faster, more violent. Crack was rising. The rules Frank lived by: silence, patience, structure, no longer mattered. Frank tried to live quietly. He spoke to kids, warned them not to follow his path. He later worked as a consultant on the film American Gangster, watching an actor play a version of himself that felt both accurate and incomplete. Frank Lucas died in 2019 at the age of 88. Natural causes: no bullets, no prison cell, no unfinished business. And the question followed him into the grave. Was he a villain or a genius? The truth is uncomfortable. Frank Lucas destroyed communities. Heroin ruined lives. There's no escaping that. But Frank also proved something the world wasn't ready to admit: that a quiet, disciplined outsider could outthink the mafia, rewrite the rules, and take power without asking permission. And it all started with $100,000. Years later, someone asked Frank if he regretted putting that money in Bumpy Johnson's casket. He could have used it for lawyers. For his family? For survival. Frank shook his head. No, he said. That money bought me something more valuable than lawyers. It bought me respect. It bought me a reputation. It bought me a throne. For 5 years, Frank Lucas was king of Harlem. And the final lesson he left behind was simple. Real power isn't loud. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. The moment you want people to know how powerful you are, you've already lost. Frank Lucas stayed quiet and became a legend. Then he got loudened, lost everything. That's the price of power.